The valley had gone silent in a way that made seasoned operators check their ammunition counts twice. Captain Marlene Reaper, Kovacs pressed her cheek against the stock of her rifle, scanning the tree line through thermal optics that showed nothing but the ambient heat of Afghan summer bleeding off sandstone cliffs. Somewhere in that maze of rocks and shadow, a dozen Navy SEALs had gone dark. Their last transmission, clipped and professional even under fire, had cut off mid-sentence 4 minutes ago. 4 minutes was an eternity when you were pinned down. The operations center at Bagram had erupted into controlled chaos. Satellite imagery showed heat signatures that might have been bodies or might have been engine blocks from disabled vehicles. Radio chatter cycled through every frequency, hunting for the encrypted burst transmission that would mean someone down there still had a working radio and a pulse. The quick reaction force was spinning up, helicopters screaming to life on the tarmac, but everyone who'd spent time in that particular stretch of Kunar province knew the mathematics of distance and time. The valley was 40 nautical miles of knife-edge ridges and natural ambush corridors. The SEALs had walked into something that had teeth. What nobody was saying, but everyone was thinking, was that this felt orchestrated. The patrol had been routine, deliberately low profile, following a dry riverbed that had been quiet for 6 weeks. Then suddenly, coordinated fire from 3 positions, RPG trails crossing the sky like meteor showers in reverse, and radio silence that suggested either catastrophic equipment failure or something worse. The senior officer coordinating the response, a Marine colonel with 2 tours in Fallujah etched into the lines around his eyes, stared at the tactical display with the expression of a man doing math he didn't like the answer to. "Get me close air support," he said quietly. "Everything we've got within 20 minutes." The operations specialist hesitated, fingers hovering over his keyboard. "Sir, we've got an A-10 package returning from a show of force run near Jalalabad. They're 15 minutes out, full combat load." The colonel's jaw worked. A-10s were sledgehammers, not scalpels, but sledgehammers had their uses when the alternative was watching good men die on a satellite feed. "Get them on frequency. Paint me the whole valley if you have to." What he didn't know, what nobody in that operations center knew yet, was that the pilot inbound wasn't someone they'd expect. The voice that would come crackling through the static in 90 seconds would be calm, almost bored, with the faintest trace of a Brooklyn accent that disappeared under stress. And the aircraft that would arrive, ugly and purposeful as divine judgment, would be flown by someone who'd already been written off, underestimated, and sidelined so many times that she'd stopped counting. Her name was Marlene Kovacs, but everyone who'd flown with her called her Reaper. Some said it was because of her weapon efficiency scores. Others whispered it was because she'd once walked away from an ejection that should have killed her, dust and smoke clinging to her flight suit like she'd crawled out of a grave. The truth was simpler and more complicated. She'd earned it the same way you earn any call sign worth having, by being exactly who you are when everything goes wrong. The A-10 Thunderbolt II she flew was not a beautiful aircraft. It was a flying gun platform built around a 30mm rotary cannon that could shred an armored vehicle into constituent atoms. Titanium bathtub protecting the cockpit, twin turbofan engines mounted high to avoid ground fire, and ingesting debris, straight wings designed for loitering over a battlefield like a patient vulture. The Air Force had been trying to retire the platform for 20 years. The Army and Marines kept vetoing the decision because when you were bleeding into Afghan soil and needed someone to make the bad guys stop existing, you didn't want a sleek fighter jet. You wanted the sound of thunder and the smell of cordite and a pilot who understood that close air support meant close enough to see faces. Marlene had logged more combat hours in the A-10 than most pilots half her age. She'd come up through the Arizona Air National Guard, back when being female in a combat aircraft meant constantly proving you belonged there. She deployed to Iraq during the surge, providing overwatch for convoys threading through Anbar province, learning to read the landscape for the telltale signs of buried IEDs the same way farmers read weather patterns. She'd put ordnance so close to friendly positions that ground commanders would later joke they could feel the heat from the explosions. She never joked back. It wasn't something to joke about. The radio in her helmet crackled with the operation's frequency. Hog 7-3, this is Bagram TOC, immediate tasking, how copy. Her right hand was already banking the aircraft toward the new coordinates before her left hand keyed the transmit switch. Hog 7-3 copies, send traffic. We've got troops in contact, danger close situation, 12 personnel unaccounted for in the Cunard Valley, grid November Quebec 742983. Multiple enemy positions, unknown strength. You're the closest asset. Marlene's eyes tracked across the moving map display, calculating fuel state, time to target, weapons loadout. She was carrying the full load, AGM-65 Maverick missiles, Mark 82 500-pound bombs, and 1,900 rounds of 30mm high-explosive incendiary ammunition for the GAU-8 Avenger cannon. Copy coordinates, 15 minutes out. What's the ground situation? There was a pause. When the controller came back, his voice had lost its professional detachment. Unknown. Last contact 4 minutes ago. They're dark. That word hung in the cockpit like smoke. Dark meant no communication. Dark meant you didn't know if they were alive, pinned down, or already casualties being dragged into the rocks by an enemy that understood the propaganda value of captured Americans. Marlene pushed the throttles forward, feeling the twin General Electric engines respond with their characteristic turbine whine. The A-10 wasn't fast, subsonic by design, but she could coax every knot of airspeed from the airframe when it mattered. Below, the Afghan landscape scrolled past in shades of tan and gray. Ridgelines sharp enough to cut clouds, valleys that swallowed entire villages in shadow, roads that were barely suggestions of human presence carved into geology that predated memory. Somewhere in that wilderness, Americans were fighting for their lives with the quiet professionalism that came from knowing nobody watching television back home would ever hear about this valley, this firefight, this particular Tuesday afternoon in a war that had long since stopped making headlines. Marlene checked her weapons panel one more time, a ritual born from muscle memory rather than necessity. Everything green, everything ready. The aircraft around her was ugly and loud and slow, but it was hers, and she knew its capabilities the way a surgeon knows their instruments. The GAU-8 cannon, mounted in the nose with the aircraft essentially built around it, could fire 65 rounds per second. Each round was the size of a beer bottle, a mix of high explosive and armor-piercing, designed to turn tanks into Swiss cheese. Against unarmored personnel in the open, it was devastation made manifest. Her weapons systems officer back at Bagram, a young captain named Rodriguez who coordinated targeting data, came on frequency. Hog 7-3, updating friendly positions. We've got possible IR strobes at grid November Quebec 743001. Advising extreme caution, we don't have confirmation of friendly versus enemy. Copy? Marlene's voice was flat, professional. Inside, she was already running through scenarios. Infrared strobes meant someone was signaling, trying to mark their position for friendly aircraft. But Taliban fighters had learned to capture American equipment. You couldn't trust anything these days except your eyes and your training, and the split-second judgment calls that separated precision strike from friendly fire incident. The valley mouth appeared ahead, a dark slash between mountain ridges that climbed toward a sky turning the deep blue of late afternoon. Marlene dropped altitude, bringing the A-10 down to 8,000 feet above ground level, low enough to make out details but high enough to give her maneuvering room. In the valley below, hidden among the rocks and sparse vegetation, 12 Navy SEALs were learning what it meant to be truly alone. Their team leader, a senior chief with the weathered face of someone who'd seen too many deployments, pressed himself flat behind a boulder that was barely adequate cover. His radio had taken shrapnel 10 minutes earlier, the casing cracked, and the internal electronics cooking off in a brief shower of sparks and acrid smoke. The team's backup radio was somewhere in the rocks with their medic, who'd been hit in the first volley and dragged to cover by two teammates who were now trapped 30 meters away in a dried-out creek bed. The Taliban fighters had appeared from nowhere, a coordinated ambush that suggested either incredible luck or detailed intelligence about American patrol patterns. Probably the latter. Someone had talked, or someone had been watching long enough to predict movements, and now a dozen of America's most elite warriors were pinned down in a kill box with limited ammunition and no way to call for help. The senior chief could hear his men returning fire in controlled bursts, maintaining discipline even as the tactical situation degraded from bad to catastrophic. One of his point men, a sniper with arms covered in traditional Filipino tattoos, had found a position with decent lines of sight and was systematically targeting enemy positions. But for every Taliban fighter who went down, two more seemed to appear. Above, invisible beyond the limits of human hearing, Marlene arrived. She banked hard, standing the A-10 on its wing, scanning the terrain below with eyes that had learned to separate threat from neutral in the chaotic visual language of combat. There, muzzle flashes winking from three separate positions arranged in a classic L-shaped ambush. And there, return fire from behind cover that looked pitifully inadequate from this altitude, but was probably keeping someone alive. She toggled her radio to the ground frequency. Any station this net, Hog 7-3 overhead with ordnance and playtime. Authenticate Papa Whiskey 7-4. Silence. She tried again, using the emergency frequency, the one that every American operator was supposed to monitor. Still nothing, which meant either their radios were down or they were too busy surviving to answer. Marlene made a decision that would later be dissected in after-action reports and briefing rooms, the kind of decision that separates adequate pilots from exceptional ones. She dropped lower, pushing the A-10 down to 5,000 feet, deliberately making herself a target. The effect was immediate. Taliban fighters who'd been focused on the Americans in the valley suddenly looked up at the sound of turbofan engines and the distinctive silhouette of an aircraft that every insurgent in Afghanistan had learned to fear. Several shifted fire toward her, green tracer rounds climbing through the afternoon air in lazy arcs that looked slow, until you remembered each round was traveling faster than sound. Marlene jinked left, felt the airframe shudder as something passed close enough to matter, and keyed her radio again. If you can hear me, mark your position with IR strobe now. I can't help you unless I know where you are. In the rocks below, the senior chief heard the voice crackling through his dead radio speaker, somehow still working despite the shattered casing, and made eye contact with his nearest teammate. They had one IR strobe left, a backup carried by their communications specialist who was now lying in a shallow depression with a through-and-through in his calf. The specialist, teeth gritted against pain that would hit full force once the adrenaline wore off, pulled the device from his vest and activated it. The strobe began pulsing in a spectrum invisible to human eyes, but brilliant to the sensors in Marlene's aircraft. She saw it immediately, a flashing beacon in her targeting pod display. Contact IR strobe, I see you. Heads down, danger close, 15 seconds. What happened next would be described in different ways depending on who was telling the story. The SEALs would say the sky cracked open. Taliban survivors would claim divine judgment arrived in the form of American fire. Marlene would simply note in her combat report that she'd employed standard close air support procedures against multiple enemy positions. The truth lived somewhere in the overlap of all three versions. In the moment when training and desperation and precise violence converged into something that felt like salvation for 12 men who'd been measuring their remaining time in minutes. The GAU-8 cannon opened up with a sound that wasn't quite gunfire and wasn't quite thunder. It was deeper, more visceral, a tearing mechanical roar that could be felt in bone marrow and dental fillings. The high-explosive rounds walked across the mountainside in a line of destruction that turned rocks to dust and flesh to memory. Marlene flew the aircraft with tiny, precise movements, her eyes locked on the targeting reticle, stitching fire across enemy positions with the steady hand of a surgeon closing an incision. 3 seconds of fire, pull up, assess, adjust, come around for another pass. The A-10 was built for this, designed to take punishment and keep fighting, to loiter over a battlefield and methodically dismantle threats with the patient brutality of industrial machinery applied to human conflict. Below, the pressure on the SEALs evaporated as Taliban fighters broke and ran or simply ceased to exist. The senior chief raised his head cautiously, watched the A-10 bank overhead in a turn so tight he could see the pilot's helmet in the cockpit, and felt something he'd later have trouble articulating. Gratitude, certainly. Relief, absolutely. But also a kind of professional recognition. The understanding that somewhere up there was someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and had just saved 12 lives with a level of skill that deserved respect regardless of anything else. Marlene made 2 more passes, systematically clearing each position, ensuring no follow-up ambush could materialize from remaining fighters. Her ammunition counter spun down. Fuel state was becoming a consideration, the point where she'd need to break off and return to base, approaching with the inexorable mathematics of jet engine consumption rates. She toggled back to the TAC frequency. Bagram TOC, Hog 7-3, enemy position suppressed, area secure for extract. Recommend immediate QRF insertion while we have control. Copy Hog 7-3. QRF is inbound 8 minutes out. Any friendly casualties? Marlene looked down at the valley, at the IR strobe still pulsing, at the tiny figures now moving in the open, regrouping with the efficient movements of professionals who just survived something they shouldn't have. Negative visual confirmation, but they're mobile. Get them out of here. She climbed back to altitude, circling overhead like a guardian that wouldn't leave until the rescue was complete. The helicopters arrived in a thunder of rotor wash and dust, Black Hawks flaring to land in a clearing barely large enough to accommodate them. The SEALs loaded fast, hauling their wounded, securing their dead. Because there were dead, there were always dead, just not as many as there would have been without the A-10 overhead. Within 3 minutes, the helicopters were airborne again, climbing fast and banking toward the relative safety of Bagram with its perimeter fences and air defense systems, an illusion of control. Marlene waited until they were clear, burning fuel she didn't have to spare, making sure nothing emerged from the rocks to take potshots at the departing aircraft. Only when the helicopters were dots on the horizon did she turn for home, the A-10's engines settling into the steady drone of cruise configuration. Her hands were steady on the controls. Her breathing was even. She'd done this enough times that the post-action adrenaline dump had learned to wait until she was on the ground. The sun was lower now, painting the mountains in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if this were any other place, any other context. Marlene flew through that light, alone in her cockpit, heading back to a base where nobody would say much of anything about what had just happened. That was the nature of the job. You went out, you did what needed doing, you came back. The operators on the ground would file their reports. She'd file hers. The intelligence analysts would mark another grid square as hostile territory. Life would continue with the rhythm of a war that had long since stopped making sense to anyone, except the people still fighting it. What she didn't know, couldn't know, was that in the helicopter racing toward Bagram, the senior chief was already asking questions. Who'd been flying that? Because that wasn't standard close air support. That was surgical, personal, the kind of flying that came from someone who understood what it meant to be on the ground, looking up, counting on someone to get it right the first time because there wouldn't be a second chance. One of his teammates, the sniper with the Filipino tattoos, had caught a glimpse through his scope during the third gun run. Saw the helmet, the size of the figure in the cockpit, and made a guess he'd keep to himself for now. But he'd seen enough female pilots over enough deployments to recognize the signs, and he'd been impressed enough by the flying to make a mental note. Find out who that was. Buy them a beer. Say thank you. Back at Bagram, Marlene went through the landing checklist with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. Gear down, 3 green lights. Flaps to landing configuration. Airspeed walking down through 200 knots, 150, final approach speed with the runway growing larger through the canopy. The A-10 touched down with its characteristic firm thump. It was never graceful, but it was always honest, and she taxied clear of the active runway, following the marshaller's signals toward the parking ramp where the crew chiefs waited. Shutdown sequence was muscle memory by now. Throttles to idle, fuel pumps off, electrical systems securing in the proper order. The engine spooled down with a descending whine that always sounded vaguely disappointed, like they'd been having fun and didn't want to stop. Marlene popped the canopy, and Afghan summer heat rolled into the cockpit like a physical presence. She pulled off her helmet, ran fingers through sweat-damp hair that was too short to do anything interesting, and climbed down the ladder with legs that remembered they'd been sitting in ejection seat tension for the past 3 hours. Her crew chief, a technical sergeant named Morrison with 20 years of fixing broken aircraft, looked up at her with the expression of someone inspecting their work. "How'd she do, ma'am?" "Perfect." Marlene handed him her helmet. "GAU-8 ran clean, no discrepancies. We'll need to reload ordnance and do a post-flight inspection, but she brought me home again." Morrison nodded, already walking around the aircraft with a trained eye that could spot problems before they became failures. Battle damage check, looking for holes or hydraulic leaks or any of the 1,000 things that could go wrong when you flew into situations where people actively tried to kill you. Marlene watched him work for a moment, then headed toward the operations building for the mandatory post-mission debrief. Someone would want to know what she'd seen, what she'd hit, how many rounds she'd expended. The bureaucracy of war, turning violence into paperwork. The operations officer, a major who'd been flying a desk for the past 2 years, looked up from his computer as she entered. "Kavach, good flight." "Troops in contact, suppressed enemy positions, no friendly casualties that I could observe. QRF extracted successfully. Should be a straightforward report." He nodded, already pulling up the mission file. "Senior Chief Erickson is asking who was flying top cover, wants to say thanks." Marlene felt something shift in her expression, carefully not quite a smile. "Tell him Hog 73. He needs more than that, he can read the report." "Will do." The major hesitated, then added, "Word is you put fire within 50 meters of their position. That's some tight work." "That's the job." She filled out the combat report with the clinical detachment of someone documenting an oil change rather than life-and-death decisions made at 500 miles per hour. Enemy positions engaged, ordnance expended, battle damage assessment. The words were inadequate to capture what had actually happened, but they were the words they had, so she used them. Signed at the bottom, turned it in, and walked out into the fatting daylight of another Afghan evening. The female quarters were in a separate building, one of the compromises the military made when it finally admitted women into combat roles. Marlene showered off the sweat and stress, changed into a clean flight suit, and headed to the dining facility where the food was mediocre but calories were calories. She ate alone, as usual, at a table near the wall where she could watch the room. Old habits from too many deployments, the constant low-level awareness that even in supposedly safe spaces, things could go wrong. Across the facility, at a table crowded with Navy personnel, Senior Chief Eric Erickson was telling a story to teammates who'd been there, but needed to hear it anyway, needed to process what had happened through the alchemy of words and shared experience. "I'm telling you, tightest close air support I've ever seen. 3-gun runs, precision fire, and she never wavered. Came in low enough we could see the damn cockpit." "A-10, one of his teammates asked. "Yeah, call sign Hog 73. I want to find out who that was." The sniper with the Filipino tattoos, whose name was Rodriguez and who'd been quiet through most of the conversation, finally spoke up. "Pretty sure it was Captain Kavach. Seen her around the flight line. Doesn't talk much." Erickson filed that information away. "Tomorrow, When the adrenaline had fully metabolized and the bruises from diving behind rocks had turned purple, he'd tracked down this Captain Kovac. Tonight, he just wanted to sit with his team and be grateful they were all sitting there to hear the story. Back in the female quarters, Marlene lay on her bunk and stared at the ceiling, waiting for sleep that might or might not come. Her mind was still flying the mission, replaying decisions, second-guessing weapon selection even though she knew it had been right. This was the part they didn't show in recruiting videos, the aftermath where you laid in the dark and wondered if you'd done enough, done it right, made the choices that would let you live with yourself tomorrow. Most nights, the answer was yes. Some nights, you weren't sure. Tonight felt like a yes, but she'd learned not to trust that feeling until more time had passed, until the reports came back confirming no friendly fire, no civilians, no mistakes that couldn't be undone. The air conditioning unit in the window rattled with its usual mechanical complaint. Outside, aircraft taxied and launched into the night, the rhythm of a war that never slept. Marlene closed her eyes and thought about nothing, the meditation technique she'd learned to shut down the mental replay long enough to get 4 hours of rest before the next flight. Tomorrow there would be another mission, another valley, another set of lives depending on her to get it right. Tonight, 12 men were alive who might not have been. That was enough. It had to be enough. At 0:30, while most of the base was sleeping or pretending to sleep, the intelligence analysts were still working. One of them, a young lieutenant with a Middle Eastern Studies degree she'd never get to use, was reviewing gun camera footage from Marlene's mission. The black and white thermal imagery showed the whole engagement from the A-10's perspective. The Taliban positions lighting up with the heat signatures of automatic weapons fire, the precise moment when 30mm rounds impacted and those signatures bloomed white-hot and then went dark. She watched the video 3 times, checking the distance between impact points and the friendly position marker. 50 meters, 45 meters on the second pass. That was danger close by any definition, close enough that if the pilot had been slightly off, if the wind had shifted, if the targeting system had glitched, American bodies would be going home in flag-draped boxes. But there'd been no glitch, no error, no tragedy. Just precise, professional violence delivered by someone who clearly knew their aircraft and their weapons system down to the last decimal point. The lieutenant made a note in her assessment file. Recommend commendation for Hog 73, exceptional close air support under combat conditions. She didn't know if anything would come of it. Awards and medals were political as much as meritorious, but it felt important to document excellence when you saw it. In the morning, the base operations tempo resumed its normal frenetic pace. Missions launched, missions returned. The ground crews serviced aircraft with the efficient exhaustion of people who'd been doing this too long to remember what normal civilian life felt like. Marlene went through her pre-flight checks on a different A-10, the one she'd flown yesterday undergoing post-mission inspection and ordnance reload. All Thunderbolts were essentially identical, but pilots still had favorites, airframes they'd learned the quirks of, that felt like home in the way that only a machine you trusted with your life could feel like home. She was halfway through the exterior inspection when Senior Chief Erickson found her. He was in his combat uniform, the tan and brown digital camouflage that the Navy had adopted, no rank insignia visible because SEALs didn't advertise who was in charge. But something about the way he carried himself, the weathered competence in his face, told Marlene this was someone who'd seen things and survived them through skill rather than luck. Captain Kovac. His voice was respectful, the tone of someone asking rather than demanding. That's me. Senior Chief Eric Erickson. I was in the valley yesterday, wanted to say thank you. Marlene looked at him, really looked, and saw the truth of it written in the way he stood, the slight hesitation in his left side that suggested cracked ribs or worse. You and your team made it out. That's all that matters. That's not all that matters. He took a step closer, lowered his voice so it wouldn't carry across the flight line. I've had close air support from a lot of pilots in a lot of places. Yesterday was different. You could have stood off, dropped bombs from altitude, kept yourself safe. Instead, you came in low, drew fire, put rounds within spitting distance of our position. That took skill and guts, and I wanted you to know it didn't go unnoticed. Something in Marlene's expression shifted, a softening around the eyes that might have been gratitude or might have been the acknowledgement that respect from someone like this actually meant something. We trained for that scenario. I just did what I was trained to do. You did it perfect. Erickson extended his hand, and after a moment Marlene shook it. His grip was firm, professional, the handshake of equals even though their ranks and services and entire worlds were different. If you're ever in Virginia Beach, first round's on me. I'll hold you to that, Senior Chief. He nodded, started to walk away, then turned back. One more thing. My guys were taking bets on who was flying that A-10. When I told them it was you, couple of them didn't believe me at first. Wanted you to know you changed some minds yesterday. Not mine. I already knew women could fly combat, but some of the younger guys, they needed to see it to believe it. So thanks for that too. Then he was gone, limping slightly as he headed back toward the SEAL compound, leaving Marlene standing by her aircraft with something warm and complicated lodged in her chest. Recognition. Respect. The knowledge that she'd proven something she shouldn't have had to prove in the first place but was glad she'd proven anyway. She finished her pre-flight inspection with movements that felt lighter somehow, less burdened by the accumulated weight of a career spent justifying her existence. That afternoon's mission was routine by comparison. Armed reconnaissance over a sector of Helmand Province, where intelligence suggested Taliban movement but nothing materialized. Marlene flew the patrol track, systems in search mode, eyes scanning terrain that all looked the same after a while. The routine missions were important too, showing presence, deterring attacks that might happen if the Taliban thought they had free rein. But they didn't carry the same weight, the same sense of purpose that came from knowing you'd made a direct difference in someone's survival. Back at Bagram after the flight, she found a message waiting in her quarters. Handwritten note on official stationery. Captain Kovac, request your presence at SEAL team briefing, 1800 hours tonight, Building 7. We'd like to buy you a beer and hear the story from your perspective. No pressure if you can't make it, but we'd be honored. Senior Chief Erickson. Marlene read the note twice, feeling the pull between professional distance and the human need for connection. She'd spent so much of her career maintaining boundaries, being the professional who didn't get too close to anyone because getting close meant vulnerability and vulnerability meant weakness. But these men had been there, had felt what it was like to be under fire and waiting for salvation that might not come. They understood in a way that most people couldn't. And maybe, just maybe, it would be okay to accept their gratitude face to face instead of deflecting it with professionalism. At 1800 hours, she walked into Building 7 and found a dozen SEALs waiting with cold bottles of Afghan brewed near beer, the closest thing to real alcohol allowed on base. They stood when she entered, a mark of respect that made her uncomfortable and proud in equal measure. Erickson made introductions. Rodriguez the sniper, Thompson the medic who'd been wounded, Jackson the communications specialist still limping from his calf wound. Names and faces she'd never seen from 5,000 feet up, but who'd been counting on her all the same. They sat around a conference table that had probably hosted tactical planning sessions, and for 2 hours they talked. Not about the mission, not really, but around it, where they were from, how they'd ended up in Afghanistan, the dark humor that military personnel used to process things that couldn't be processed any other way. Marlene found herself laughing, genuinely laughing, for the first time in months. Found herself telling stories about early days in the Guard, when being a female pilot meant constant scrutiny and the pressure to be twice as good to be considered half as competent. That's still a thing, Jackson asked, the double standard. Less than it used to be, Marlene said carefully. More about proving yourself individually now rather than proving all women can fly. But yeah, you still get the occasional asshole who thinks you only got here because of quotas. Rodriguez shook his head. Anyone who says that didn't see what you did yesterday, that was pure skill, anyone with eyes could see it. The conversation drifted to aircraft, weapons systems, the technical details that military professionals could discuss for hours without getting bored. Marlene explained how the GAU-8 worked, why the A-10 was so effective at close air support, the training regimen that turned pilots into precision instruments. They listened with genuine interest, asking smart questions, making her feel less like a novelty and more like a peer. It was a gift they probably didn't realize they were giving, that sense of belonging. When she finally stood to leave, Erickson walked her to the door. "This was good. My guys needed to decompress, process what happened. Having you here helped." "Helped me too," Marlene admitted. "Sometimes you forget there are people on the ground, not just grid coordinates and target packages. Good to put faces to the mission. You ever need anything, I mean anything, you've got friends now. We take care of people who take care of us." She nodded, not trusting herself to say more, and walked out into the Afghan night. Above, stars wheeled across a sky so clear and dark you could see the Milky Way as a river of light. Marlene stood there for a moment, breathing air that smelled of dust and jet fuel and the peculiar mineral scent of a desert after dark. Tomorrow there would be another flight, another mission. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was part of something larger than herself, connected to the human reality of the work she did. The war continued, indifferent to individual moments of connection or gratitude. Marlene flew 60 more combat missions over the next 4 months, each one adding to the calculus of experience that separated veteran pilots from survivors. Most were routine, show of force, armed reconnaissance, convoy escort. A few were more kinetic, requiring her to employ weapons against confirmed enemy positions, while ground commanders talked her onto target with the clipped precision of people who'd done this too many times. She never flew with anything less than complete focus, never took for granted that the A-10 would bring her home, or that her targeting would be precise enough to avoid tragedy. Word had spread through the operator community about the pilot in Kunar Valley. Not her name, not specifically, but the story. Danger-close gun runs, precision fire, an A-10 that had appeared exactly when needed and done exactly what was required. Stories like that took on a life of their own in the military, growing with each retelling, accruing details that might or might not have been accurate, but captured an emotional truth about what it felt like to be saved by someone who was very good at their job. Marlene heard the whispers but didn't correct them or claim ownership. That wasn't why you did the work. You did it because someone had to, because you trained for it, because there was a specific and narrow set of skills you possessed that could make the difference between living and dying for people on the ground. Recognition was nice, but it wasn't the point. The point was getting it right every single time, because you didn't get credit for the 19 times you did it perfectly if you screwed up on the 20th mission and killed friendly troops. Her tour was winding down. 4 months left before rotation back to the States, to the Arizona desert where the Air National Guard would debrief her and download her lessons learned and slot her back into the training pipeline for the next generation of pilots. She'd miss the flying, miss the purpose. Wouldn't miss the heat or the dust or the constant background stress of living in a place where people wanted to kill you. The calculus of deployment, balancing what you gained against what you lost. Then came a mission that would redefine everything. It started with bad intelligence, the kind that seemed solid until it turned out to be catastrophically wrong. A village in Kandahar province had been identified as a Taliban staging area, confirmed by multiple sources, marked for a clear-and-hold operation by Army Rangers. The plan was textbook: air support overhead, ground forces insert at dawn, secure the village, exploit any intelligence found. Marlene was flying top cover with another A-10 pilot, a captain named Williams who'd been in-country for 2 months, and still had the nervous energy of someone who hadn't fully internalized the rhythm of combat operations. They arrived overhead as the first light was breaking, the sky that particular shade of pre-dawn blue that made everything look clean and possible. Below, the Rangers were moving into position, spreading out in a tactical formation that had been practiced 10,000 times in training. Marlene scanned her sensor displays, looking for anything that registered as threat. Heat signatures, movement patterns, the telltale signs of an ambush being set up. Everything looked quiet. Too quiet, maybe, but she'd learned that sometimes quiet was just quiet. The Rangers entered the village, and the world caught fire. It wasn't Taliban fighters in that village. It was civilians, families who'd been there for generations, farmers and shepherds and children who'd had the catastrophic bad luck to be present when faulty intelligence had painted a target on their homes. The Rangers realized it almost immediately. No military-age males with weapons, no fortified positions, just terrified people running from buildings. But by then, the shooting had started. Confusion and fear and split-second decisions made in the fog of war. And overhead, Marlene was being asked to provide fire support for a situation that had already gone wrong in ways that couldn't be fixed. Hog 7-3, be advised, we're taking fire from the southern compound. Need immediate suppression. Marlene's finger hovered over the weapon release, every instinct screaming that something was wrong. Southern compound showed thermal signatures consistent with people, yes, but not people in fighting positions. People huddled together, the pattern of civilians sheltering rather than fighters maneuvering. She keyed the radio. Hog 7-3, negative contact on enemy positions. I have possible civilians in that compound. Hog 7-3, we are taking effective fire. I need you to engage now. Time compressed. The Rangers on the ground were hearing gunshots, seeing muzzle flashes, reacting to what they perceived as threats. From Marlene's position, 5,000 feet up with sensors that could penetrate walls and see heat signatures, the picture looked different. Looked like chaos and panic, not coordinated resistance. She made a decision that would haunt her and define her, the kind of choice that separated following orders from doing what was right even when what was right could end your career. Negative, ground commander, I will not engage that target. I assess civilian presence, danger of friendly fire incident. Request you pull back and reassess. The radio went silent. Then a different voice, harder and more senior. Hog 7-3, this is Actual 6. You will engage targets as directed or I will report you for failure to provide support. How copy? Marlene looked at her targeting display at the compound where people were hiding and felt the weight of 12 years of flying and every decision that had led to this moment. Her voice, when it came, was steady as granite. Hog 7-3 copies your order and declines to engage. I will not fire on a target I assess as civilian. You want that compound hit, you'll need to find another pilot. The aftermath was nuclear. By the time Marlene landed, there were officers waiting to escort her to a conference room where a colonel with the deadest eyes she'd ever seen informed her she was grounded pending investigation. The Rangers had pulled back, reassessed, and confirmed what she'd seen from overhead. No Taliban, no weapons cache, just families who'd been caught in a nightmare of mistaken identity and faulty intelligence. Several were dead anyway. The fog of war had done its work before anyone could stop it. But Marlene's refusal to add ordnance to the situation had prevented it from becoming a massacre that made international headlines. That should have mattered. In a reasonable world, it would have mattered. But the military was not always reasonable, especially when an officer had publicly questioned the judgment of a ground commander in the middle of a firefight. There were rules, procedures, chains of command that couldn't be violated even when violating them was the right thing to do. Marlene sat through investigation after investigation, answering the same questions with the same answers, watching her career circle the drain because she'd refused to kill civilians. The SEALs heard about it. Erickson made calls, pulled strings, leveraged every ounce of influence he had to advocate for the pilot who'd saved his team. Other operators who'd benefited from Marlene's close air support spoke up, filing statements that praised her judgment and professionalism. The intelligence analyst who'd reviewed her gun camera footage wrote a detailed report explaining why the refusal to engage had been the correct decision based on available sensor data. Slowly, reluctantly, the machinery of military justice ground toward a conclusion that wouldn't destroy her completely. 3 months after the incident, Marlene was cleared of wrongdoing and returned to flight status. But the damage was done. She'd been marked as someone who didn't follow orders, who prioritized personal judgment over command authority. The kind of pilot that made senior officers nervous, even if she'd been right. Her performance reports would carry the stain forever, subtle language that future boards would read between the lines of. She wouldn't make major, wouldn't command a squadron. The trajectory of her career had been altered by a single decision, to do the right thing instead of the ordered thing. She told herself it was worth it. On bad nights, lying awake at 3 in the morning, she almost believed it. Her final mission in Afghanistan came on a crystalline November morning when the air was cold enough to see your breath and the mountains looked close enough to touch. Routine patrol, nothing special, her last flight before heading home to Arizona and whatever came next. Marlene flew the route with the muscle memory of hundreds of previous missions, scanning terrain she'd memorized, following procedures that had become second nature. The A-10 performed flawlessly, as it always did, ugly and reliable as the day it rolled off the assembly line. Below, American forces were packing up forward operating bases, collapsing the network of outposts and checkpoints that had defined the occupation for 2 decades. The war was ending, not with victory or defeat, but with exhaustion, both sides tired of fighting for objectives that had long since stopped making sense. Marlene wondered what would happen to the people she'd protected, the operators and soldiers and Marines who'd counted on her. Wondered if they'd remember the A-10's overhead, the sound of the GAU-8, the knowledge that someone was watching. She landed for the last time at Bagram, taxied to the parking ramp, shut down the engines with a finality that felt heavier than usual. Morrison was waiting as always, and they went through the post-flight inspection together without speaking much. What was there to say? They'd done their jobs, kept the aircraft flying, brought each other home. Now it was over, and they'd go back to their separate lives and remember Afghanistan as the place where they'd been most alive and most afraid, often simultaneously. The flight home was commercial, a rotator contract jet packed with service members from every branch, all heading back to the States with the hollow-eyed exhaustion of people who'd spent too long in the pressure cooker. Marlene sat by the window, watching the Hindu Kush disappear below clouds, then the Iranian plateau, then the Mediterranean, the geography of war shrinking into insignificance. By the time they touched down at Ramstein Air Base in Germany for refueling, Afghanistan felt like something that had happened to someone else, a deployment she'd watched rather than lived through. Back in Arizona, the desert was the same, but everything else felt different. Marlene drove from the airport to her apartment, a small one-bedroom in Tucson that she'd barely lived in, and stared at furniture she didn't remember buying. The silence was overwhelming after months of constant noise, aircraft, generators, the background hum of a military base. She turned on the television just to have sound, then turned it off again because nothing on the news made sense from this side of the deployment. The National Guard wanted her to speak at recruiting events, tell stories about women in combat aviation, inspire the next generation. She declined politely and repeatedly. That wasn't who she was, wasn't the version of herself she wanted to perform for cameras. She was a pilot, not a spokesperson. The distinction mattered to her even if it didn't matter to the public affairs officers who kept calling. Senior Chief Erickson tracked her down 6 months after she returned. He was between deployments, visiting family in California, and made the drive to Arizona specifically to see her. They met at a dive bar in downtown Tucson, the kind of place where nobody cared who you were or what you'd done, and talked for hours about nothing and everything. He'd heard about what happened in Kandahar, about her decision and the aftermath. Wanted her to know that in the SEAL community, Among the people who understood what precision and judgment meant, she was respected. More than respected, revered. "You made the hard call," he said, nursing a beer. "The call that protects who we are, even when it costs you personally. That's character. That's leadership. Don't let the bureaucrats tell you different." Marlene looked into her own beer, watching condensation run down the glass. "Didn't feel like leadership. Felt like I was ending my career." "Maybe, but you saved lives and preserved honor. Those things matter even when nobody's watching." They parted as friends, promising to stay in touch with the sincerity of people who probably wouldn't but meant it anyway. Marlene drove back to her apartment through Tucson traffic and sat in her car for 20 minutes, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of transition from who she'd been to who she was becoming. The uniform still fit. The flight suit still hung in her closet. But something essential had shifted, and she wasn't sure she'd ever get it back. The years that followed were good but different. Marlene stayed in the Guard, flying training missions and the occasional homeland defense scramble when civilian aircraft went off course. She instructed new pilots, passing on lessons learned in combat, teaching weapon employment and tactical decision-making to kids who'd never heard a shot fired in anger. Some of them were excellent, some washed out. All of them learned that flying was about more than stick and rudder skills, that judgment mattered as much as technical proficiency. She made captain, then major against her own expectations, the promotion board apparently deciding that her record in combat outweighed the black mark from Kandahar. Flew A-10s until the Air Force finally succeeded in retiring the platform, transitioning to F-16s with reluctance and the sad knowledge that she'd never again fly an aircraft so perfectly designed for supporting troops in contact. The Viper was fast and versatile, but it wasn't the same, would never be the same. Somewhere along the way, Reaper stopped being just a call sign and became a legend. Stories circulated in ready rooms and training squadrons, each iteration adding details but preserving the core truth. Precision under pressure, lives saved through skill, a pilot who'd made the hard choices. New A-10 pilots heard about her before they ever met her, built up expectations that real human couldn't possibly meet. Marlene found it amusing and uncomfortable in equal measure, the mythology that grew around her like coral building up on a shipwreck. She was 42 when the diagnosis came. Routine physical blood work that came back with numbers that didn't make sense, referral to an oncologist who used terms like aggressive and treatment options, with the practiced gentleness of someone who delivered bad news professionally. Lymphoma, stage 3, caught early enough to treat but advanced enough to be serious. Marlene sat in the doctor's office and felt her life divide into before and after, the way it had on that first deployment, the way it had in Kandahar. Except this time the division was starker, more final. This time she might not make it to the other side. Chemotherapy was brutal in ways that combat had never been. At least in combat you could fight back. Against cancer, you just endured, taking poison into your body and hoping it killed the right cells before it killed you. Marlene lost her hair, lost 20 pounds, lost the physical strength that had always been part of her identity. The Air Force put her on medical leave, grounding her indefinitely, taking away the one thing that had defined her existence. She spent months feeling like a shadow, a ghost of the pilot she'd been, measuring her life in treatment cycles and blood counts, and the small victories of getting out of bed without wanting to vomit. The SEAL community heard about it through the informal network that connected operators across services. Erickson called, then visited, bringing with him a rotating cast of teammates who treated her with the gentle respect reserved for wounded warriors. They didn't pity her, which Marlene appreciated more than she could articulate. They just showed up, sat with her through treatment, told stupid jokes and war stories that made her laugh even when laughing hurt. Rodriguez came with his wife, both of them awkward and kind, staying for an afternoon that turned into an evening. Jackson sent care packages from whatever deployment he was on, boxes of candy and books and stupid deployment swag that made her smile. 18 months after diagnosis, The oncologist used the word remission with cautious optimism. The cancer was gone, beaten back by chemicals and radiation, and sheer stubborn refusal to die. Marlene started rebuilding her body with the same methodical focus she brought to everything, regaining strength, passing the physical fitness tests that would clear her for flight status. The guard welcomed her back with genuine warmth, putting her back in the training pipeline, letting her fly again even though everyone knew she was on borrowed time. Cancer that aggressive often came back. She made it 3 more years before the second diagnosis. This time it was different, faster, less responsive to treatment. The oncologist's careful optimism gave way to frank conversations about time frames and quality of life. Marlene was 46, had logged 8,000 flight hours, had saved lives and made impossible decisions, and lived more intensely than most people managed in twice as many years. It felt like enough. It felt like it should be enough. The Air Force retired her with full honors and a medical discharge that came with pension and benefits, and the thanks of a grateful nation, phrases that sounded hollow but were meant sincerely. There was a ceremony, small and private, where the commander of her fighter wing talked about her career and her service and the example she'd set. Marlene stood in her dress uniform, thinner than she'd been but still standing straight, and accepted a folded flag and a shadow box containing her medals and patches and pilot wings. She gave a short speech about the privilege of serving, about the people she'd flown with and for, about the aircraft that had brought her home from places that tried to kill her. In the audience, wearing civilian clothes but unmistakable in their bearing, sat 15 Navy SEALs who'd made the trip to Arizona. Erickson, Rodriguez, Jackson, Thompson, and others whose lives had intersected with hers in a valley in Afghanistan 13 years earlier. They stood when she received her flag, a sign of respect that made her throat tighten and her eyes burn. These men, who dealt in precision violence and tactical excellence, had come to say goodbye to a pilot they'd never forgotten. After the ceremony, they gathered at the same dive bar where she'd met Erickson years before. Someone had reserved the back room, and they filled it with laughter and stories, and the particular kind of memorial that warriors gave each other while still alive. Marlene sat at the center of it, drinking water because her system couldn't handle alcohol anymore, listening to them talk about missions and close calls, and the times when having an A-10 overhead had made all the difference. "You know what you gave us," Erickson said, standing up with the unsteady formality of someone 3 beers in. "Not just fire support, not just precision strikes. You gave us the knowledge that someone was watching, someone competent, someone who wouldn't let us down. That's worth more than all the ordnance in the Air Force inventory." The others nodded, raised their drinks, toasted her with sincerity that couldn't be faked. Marlene felt something break open in her chest, tears she'd been holding back for months finally releasing. These men had seen her at her best, had trusted her with their lives, had remembered her when it would have been easier to forget. That was legacy. That was what mattered when everything else fell away. She died 6 months later at home, with hospice care and pain management, and the small dignity of choosing how the end would come. The Guard gave her a military funeral, full honors, a missing man formation that flew overhead while taps echoed across the cemetery. The SEALs were there, of course, and pilots she'd trained, and crew chiefs who'd maintained her aircraft. They buried her in her flight suit, with her wings and her patches and her call sign stenciled on the fabric over her heart. Reaper. The story didn't end there. Stories like that never really end. They get told and retold, passed down through generations of pilots who need to understand that skill and judgment and courage aren't abstract concepts, but things that real people embodied in specific moments. Marlene Reaper Kovacs became a case study in close air support, a cautionary tale about integrity in combat, an inspiration for female pilots who followed in her contrail. Training squadrons used her gun camera footage to teach weapon employment. The Strike Fighter Tactics Instructor Program included her Kandahar decision in their ethics curriculum. Somewhere in Arizona, in a museum dedicated to the A-10 Thunderbolt II, there's a display with her photo, her medals, and a placard explaining her career. Next to it sits one of the actual Avenger cannons from an A-10 she flew, the 7 barrels scarred and worn from firing thousands of rounds in defense of troops in contact. School groups walk past it without understanding what they're seeing. Veterans pause, read the placard, and sometimes cry. In Virginia Beach, at the SEAL compound where Erickson retired after 30 years of service, there's a bar tradition. When a new operator joins the team, when they're being welcomed into the brotherhood, someone tells them the story of the valley in Kunar province. The story changes with each telling, details shift, dialogue gets polished, the legend grows, but the core remains constant. When everything went wrong and death was certain, salvation came in the form of an A-10 and a pilot who refused to give up on them. The new operators listen with the attention of people hearing something important, and then someone raises a glass to Reaper, wherever she is. Time moves on. The war in Afghanistan ended, troops came home, the news cycle moved to other crises. The generation of pilots who'd flown A-10s in combat aged out, replaced by younger aviators who'd never fought in the kind of sustained ground campaigns that made close air support essential. The Air Force finally retired the Thunderbolt, replacing it with platforms that were faster and more expensive, but less capable at the specific mission of keeping soldiers alive through precision fire. Progress, they called it, though the Marines and Army grumbled about losing their guardian angel. But in ready rooms and tactical training centers, in the oral history that military personnel carry with them from assignment to assignment, Marlene's story persisted. Because it wasn't really a story about aircraft or weapons systems or the mechanics of close air support. It was a story about a person who'd been counted out, underestimated, sidelined by prejudice and bureaucracy, who'd proven through sheer competence that excellence doesn't care about demographics. It was a story about making hard choices, the choice to risk yourself for others, the choice to refuse an unlawful order, the choice to live with integrity even when integrity cost you everything. Years after her death, a young pilot named Sarah Chen, no relation to anyone in this story, despite the coincidence of names, stood in front of that museum display in Arizona. She was 25, fresh out of flight school, assigned to F-35s because that was the platform of the future. She'd heard about Reaper in training, heard the stories without fully understanding what they meant. But standing there, reading the placard, looking at the photograph of a woman who'd been only 20 years older than Sarah was now, something clicked into place. This was possible. Not easy, not without cost, but possible. Sarah took a photo of the display, posted it to social media with a caption about inspiration and legacy. It went viral in the way that military content sometimes did, spreading through veteran communities and active duty personnel, generating comments from people who'd served with Reaper or heard about her, or just wanted to add their own stories of female pilots who'd proven themselves in combat. The post eventually reached Rodriguez, now retired and working as a contractor, who added his own comment. "She saved my life and the lives of my brothers. The story you hear doesn't do justice to how good she was. Remember her name." That comment got shared tens of thousands of times. And somewhere in that digital conversation, in the space between memory and myth, Marlene Reaper, Kavech became immortal in the way that matters most to warriors. As a standard to aspire to, a reminder that excellence and integrity and courage weren't abstract values, but things you demonstrated through action when the stakes were highest. The sky continues to fill with aircraft flown by pilots of all backgrounds, all identities, all stories. Some of them know about Reaper. Many don't. But they all benefit from the path she helped clear, the precedent she set, the proof that competence matters more than demographics. The military changes slowly, reluctantly, always fighting the last war while preparing for the next. But it does change, pushed forward by individuals who refuse to accept that the way things are is the way things have to be. In a valley in Afghanistan, if you know where to look, there's still evidence of what happened that day when 12 SEALs were pinned down and an A-10 arrived overhead. Spent 30mm cases half buried in the soil, impact craters slowly eroding under annual rains, the memory of violence fading into landscape. Local shepherds avoid the area, tell stories about American demons that scream down from the sky in planes that looked like flying guns. They're not entirely wrong. War leaves scars on terrain and memory both. The SEALs who were there that day have mostly retired now. Erickson runs a security consulting firm. Rodriguez teaches marksmanship at a civilian shooting range. Jackson did another 10 years, then went to medical school, became the doctor he'd wished for during firefights when the medic was hit. They stay in touch, group chat that oscillates between crude humor and genuine affection, the bond of shared trauma that never quite fades. Every November, on the anniversary of Reaper's death, they post the same thing. A photo of an A-10, a raised glass, the call sign that meant survival. The Air Force doesn't officially commemorate individual pilots the way the Navy names ships or the Army names installations. But in the collective memory of close air support community, in the institutional knowledge that gets passed down through mentorship and war stories, Marlene's presence persists. New pilots learn her tactics, study her decisions, understand that the job isn't just about flying, but about the lives you're protecting. The standard she set, precision, judgment, integrity, remains the standard even as technology evolves and platforms change. There's an irony to legacy, how the things you're remembered for might not be the things you thought most important. Marlene would probably have said her greatest achievement was simply doing her job well, consistently, for 12 years of combat operations. The dramatic rescues, the hard ethical choices, the barriers broken, those were just parts of the work, not separate from it. But legacy isn't something you control. It's what others make of your actions after you're gone, the meaning they extract, the inspiration they find. So the story continues, spreading outward through time and space, touching people who'll never fly aircraft or wear uniforms but who recognize something universal in a pilot who refused to compromise her principles. It becomes a parable, a lesson, a reminder that individual choices matter even in systems so large they seem to render individuals insignificant. The specifics fade. Future generations won't remember the exact valley, the precise weapon employment, the detailed aftermath. But they'll remember the essence: competence under pressure, courage to refuse, legacy built through action. The sun sets over Arizona desert that looks nothing like Afghanistan but shares the same austere beauty, the same sense of landscape indifferent to human drama. Somewhere in that desert, at a civilian airport, a young woman walks toward an aircraft that will take her on her first solo flight. She's nervous and excited, checking her pre-flight with movements made careful by understanding that aviation doesn't forgive mistakes. On her flight suit, unauthorized but tolerated by her instructor, she's sewn a small patch, an A-10 silhouette with a single word underneath: Reaper. She doesn't know the full story yet. We'll learn it later, the way pilots learn all the important stories, through late-night conversations and ready-room traditions and the oral history that preserves what official records miss. But she knows enough, that women can fly combat aircraft, that competence earns respect, that there's a standard worth aspiring to set by someone who came before. That knowledge, that inspiration, is Marlene's gift to a future she never saw but helped create. The aircraft's engine catches, settles into a steady roar. The young woman goes through her checklist one more time, then taxis toward the runway where she'll lift off into an Arizona sky that stretches infinite and blue. She's carrying forward something she doesn't fully understand yet but will, eventually, when she faces her own moments of choice and challenge. She's carrying forward the knowledge that you can be excellent and ethical simultaneously, that integrity doesn't require permission, that the hardest choices often define you more completely than the easy ones. And somewhere in whatever place warriors go when their battles are finished, Marlene Reaper Kovacs watches another pilot take flight and feels something like satisfaction. The work continues. The mission persists. The legacy endures, not in monuments or medals but in the actions of people who heard her story and decided they could be brave too. That's enough. That's always been enough. That's what it means to serve something larger than yourself, and trust that the ripples of your choices will spread farther than you'll ever see. The sky receives another aircraft, another pilot, another story beginning where hers ended. The cycle continues, will always continue, as long as there are people willing to strap into machines and fly toward danger because someone needs them to. The A-10s are retired now, museum pieces and memories, but what they represented, protection, precision, the promise that someone competent was watching from above, that remains. Changes form but doesn't disappear. Lives on in different aircraft, different missions, different pilots who learned the same lessons Marlene learned about what really matters when everything is on the line. And in a valley halfway around the world, the sun rises on landscape that remembers violence and victory both, where rocks still bear the scars of 30-millimeter impacts and local stories still whisper about the day American firepower fell like judgment from a clear blue sky. The people who live there don't know her name, won't ever know the specifics of who saved whom or why. But they remember the sound, that distinctive thunder of the GAU-8 that announced someone very good at their job was working. They'll remember that sound for generations, passing it down the same way Marlene's story gets passed down, both becoming myth that carries truth deeper than fact ever could. That's how warriors achieve immortality, not through monuments but through memory, not through fame but through the lives they touched and saved and changed simply by being exactly who they were when it mattered most.